much indeed. Stephen Kinnock. Stephen.
Thank you very much. A question about the role of the European Parliament in all of this. On the 11th of September, the European Parliament issued a pretty unequivocal statement saying that the provisions in the Internal Market Bill which seek to override the legally binding withdrawal agreement were a breach of international law and not acceptable to the European Parliament, and said that it will refuse to ratify under any circumstances any agreement between the EU and the UK that breaches the withdrawal agreement. Perhaps to you first, Georgina, can you sort of give an assessment there of the extent to which that European Parliament position is influencing the position of the EU member states?
Thank you, Stephen. Well, I think, this is valid for the European Parliament, but also for the member states, where they've been very clear that any future agreement, there would only be a future agreement, providing there's full application of the withdrawal agreement. So that has always been a condition from the very beginning. That being said, I think the European Parliament felt that they hadn't had enough, not input so much in the Article 50 negotiations, but time to really deliberate it, because they've got their own constituents that they need to stand up for. So in a sense, if they are going to try and maximise that time and to show that, yes, they are standing up for what they believe in. So a lot of this is also politics. I guess my conclusion is if EU member states are happy with the deal, I doubt that very much the European Parliament would vote it down. That being said, the withdrawal agreement, the full application of the withdrawal agreement is very important. And so if this bill, the Internal Market Bill, goes through unamended, I suspect that that will decrease flexibility and compromise in other areas, and particularly in the future trade agreement. So I wouldn't take that threat lightly. Of course, there is always the possibility that they would vote it down. But I think more to the point, it really makes Michel Barnier's task a lot harder, because he's having to go to the European Parliament and to member states and say, look, let's move away from our mandate, trust me on this. And then they can turn around and say, well, how can we trust you on this? Because the UK is going ahead and trying to unpick the withdrawal agreement. So would they vote it down? Question mark. Probably not, but it will certainly make them more bullish on other aspects, particularly on future trade agreements.
That's great. Thanks very much. Just turning to Catherine now, the Bob Neal Amendment. Just wondering what assessment you can make of whether that's had any effect in terms of the EU's legal service, and whether there's been any success in terms of the objective of that amendment to give some reassurance to the European Union. Or whether the Bob Neal Amendment is just sort of seen as smoke and mirrors. Perhaps Catherine could give a view on that.
Thank you for that. The Bob Neal Amendment allows the House of Commons to approve any exercise of these powers. It is just the House of Commons, the House of Lords is to note. But the point is that the powers themselves, if exercised, will breach Article 5 and Article 10 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and also Articles 4 and 5 of the Withdrawal Agreement itself. And so the fact is, I don't think it makes that much difference, because the fact is that clauses 42 and 43 say clearly that there will be powers to disapply or modify Article 10 of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and likewise turning off Article 4, which is on direct effect, in respect of clauses 42 and 43. So the fact is there is a breach of international law. Now, we know the argument that under domestic law, it would be lawful because of Section 38 of the 2020 Act, and Section 38 reasserts parliamentary sovereignty. It was always clear that Parliament was sovereign, and thus under the Internal Market Bill, it's a later bill in time, so will prevail over the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020. But that's at domestic level, not at international level. It will be a breach of international law.
And just to probe that a bit further in terms of the implications of breaching international law, given your sort of legal expertise and perspective on this. To what extent do you think that that might influence British attempts to strike other trade deals, or indeed to enter into any other legal arrangements? I mean, are we sort of, by doing this, sending our trade negotiators naked into the conference chambers, to quote Naira Bevan, or indeed other aspects of the United Kingdom's standing in the world, for example, even things like our sovereign debt status?
Thank you. I wouldn't necessarily say naked, but maybe semi-clad. It's not helped our position very much. Now, we also know that the UK did conclude the trade agreement with Japan after the internal market bill had been published. So it's perhaps not devastating. But on the other hand, I think it raises a difficult moral point that when we criticise other states for non-compliance with international law, traditionally we've done it from the perspective of having been acting in compliance with international law ourselves. The fact that there is a breach, the UK says, or Brandon Lewis has said, it's a specific and limited breach. Nevertheless, it's a specific and limited breach of something which is fundamental to the Withdrawal Agreement, namely key parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so it might be limited because it's about the Northern Ireland Protocol, but it's also fundamental to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was entered into less than a year ago.
Thank you very much. And my final question is to Shankar, and it's, I suppose, on negotiating strategy. One of the running themes of the government throughout these negotiations, at least certainly since this current government has been in place, is that by threatening no deal, you increase your chances of getting a deal, and you increase your leverage. Can you give a single example of where that strategy has succeeded? Is there any evidence at all that threatening no deal or threatening to break international law in any way has led to a softening of the European Union's position, or in any way increasing the chances of getting a deal?
Well, I mean, I think that this is a sort of sui generis negotiation, as we said. It's not like a normal trade negotiation, which the EU would do with other third parties. And I think what the challenge the UK government had here is to get the European Union to understand that it, as David Frost said in his Brussels speech, that the idea that the UK was going to be an independent, in the case of fisheries, independent port and coastal state, in the case of other aspects of the negotiations, an independent country with its own legal order, and that it wouldn't put another entity's legal order over its own legal order, that these were not negotiating positions, that this was actually, in his words, the purpose of the project. And it's proved to be quite difficult to get that message across to the EU, and the government, I think, has manifested various degrees of desperation to get that message across. I do think that message is now finally landed, and that's why we're seeing some movement. But if they hadn't taken a strong position, I'm not sure.
What can you give an example of movement that we're
well,
seeing?
I think the most obvious one is this movement on state aids, where the initial EU position was you can only satisfy our concern about level playing field and about market distortions in your market by adopting our own legal order, EU state aids rules and full Court of Justice dispute settlement mechanism over the top into your legal order. That's the only way you can satisfy us. I think that's not their view now. I think their view now is, yes, there are other ways you can do it, but we want to see some evidence that you're going to. That is a massive change, because one is impossible to achieve, and the other is eminently possible to achieve, and there's quite a big landing zone. So I think that would be one example. I just go back to the I don't follow up on the issue of the internal market bill, which I don't particularly understand why Brandon Lewis said what he said about that. I don't see that this is a violation of international law, because it gives ministers powers that would not be exercised except in the event of no trade deal, no agreement in the Joint Committee. Those powers haven't been used yet. So in terms of the international law violation, that would relate to the the Withdrawal Agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol, but one has to differentiate international law from European law. And setting aside direct effect and so forth are matters of European law. And you've got two entities here. You've got the EU and you've got the UK, and they both have their own internal legal orders. What I would also say about that is, if there is no agreement for a free trade agreement and there's no joint committee agreement, we are going to have a problem here, because the NI protocol is full of inconsistencies and ambiguities. It provides that Northern Ireland is in the UK customs territory, and that has to mean something. Similarly, it cannot have been the intention of the parties that EU state aids rules would apply to the whole of the UK through the back door of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is the case here. And therefore, there needs to be some clarification on that point, obviously, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this deep debate about state aids if the EU knew that the state aids rules would be covered in the event of no deal anyway. So there are important clarifications that need to be made. Perhaps the most important one of which is, what do you do across the GB-NI boundary for products coming from GB into Northern Ireland, and how do you manage the at-risk, not at-risk category, where the UK would say, no doubt, that because Northern Ireland's in our own customs territory, we can determine what is not at risk, provided we can show the Joint Committee that there is a particular class of products that is absolutely not at risk, because we've got track and trace and whatever else we've got to prove that. And we would want that not at risk category for movements only GB to NI to be a pretty large category of goods, perhaps as much as 70% by value of the goods that move across the GB-NI boundary. The EU current position is that everything's at risk unless the Joint Committee says it's not at risk. So okay. I think there are significant changes.
Right, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Stephen.